Hello, Regulatory Affairs students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 11 on the role of the Regulatory Affairs Officer. This will be a short lecture because the slides primarily cover the main topics, and we'll be dealing with this issue in greater detail in the second term when we deal with post-market surveillance and with socioeconomics. But I just wanted to quickly touch base with you on this Lesson 11. All right, so let's quickly go through here. And there's a couple of key points I want to make is the role of the Regulatory Affairs Officer relative to the regulator, which is a really key point, because one of the things you discover is when you talk to regulators is that they place a great deal of value on the quality of the Regulatory Affairs Officer within regulated companies and institutions, because for the reasons I'm going to discuss very quickly. Because there are two sides to the regulatory implementation equation: the roles and responsibility of the state regulator and the roles and responsibilities of the Regulatory Affairs Officer. The Regulatory Affairs Officer typically exists under various job titles in corporations and non-government organizations, right? It can be public relations officer with regulatory roles. It can be a regulatory affairs officer. It can be a compliance officer, it could be called. There are different titles, but the training you're getting are applicable to all of those titles, right? In fact, the state regulator and the regulatory affairs officer are both trying to manage a process within the law and in compliance with the applicable regulations. So in many ways, the regulator and the regulatory affairs officer are working on the same issues, and they're trying to achieve the same objectives, which is a high level of voluntary compliance, which we've already learned about, right? And that becomes very, very important. That's why the regulatory affairs officer is valued as much as they are by the regulator, because when the regulator picks up the phone, he or she is talking to somebody knowledgeable at the other end of the line. There's nothing they dislike more than when they try to contact a company about a compliance issue and that contact is not trained in regulation, doesn't understand the law, doesn't understand how to go about fostering compliance. That's a very difficult situation for the regulator as well as the company, all right? Because regulatory affairs officers are the crucial link between their company, its products and services, and the state regulatory authority. It's the regulatory affairs department that gets the call from the regulator, right? If something is amiss or a report is late or whatever. And obviously you don't want that to have happen, because that could end up costing your employer significant issues, right? And so an effective relationship between the regulatory affairs officer can serve to extend the effectiveness of the regulator into the interworkings of the regulated entity. So because the regulators can't be there. The regulatory affairs officer is there. They're the one that will chase down information and pursue compliance where there may be difficulties. And so the regulator has a great deal of interest in supporting the regulatory affairs officer if they're deemed to be working to bring the company into compliance, right? And when a regulation has been well developed and consulted, the regulatory affairs officer can be thought of as a regulatory enforcement officer within the company that employs them, which is essentially what your boss's boss is going to ask you to do, to make sure that appropriate steps are taken to make sure that the company stays in voluntary compliance, because any reputable company wants to stay in good standing with the regulator, right? Regulatory affairs officers can also be a very valuable source of insight and information for regulators if there's a problem, or if they're questioning the regulator. I mean, how is this working? What's going? The regulatory affairs officer can be a very valuable outreach for the regulator. All right. Now, typical activities of the regulatory affairs officer can range widely, right? But here are some typical ones, right? Keeping abreast of international legislation, guidelines, and customer practices in all countries that the company is involved in or trading to, right? Collecting, collating, and evaluating scientific data that has been researched by colleagues. That's also going to be an important role, particularly if you're going for pre-market approvals. Developing and writing clear submissions and subsequent explanations of new product licenses and license renewals. That has to be done on a systematic basis. The regulatory department does that for the company. preparing submissions for license variations and renewals to strict deadlines that can substantially impact the firm's bottom line, right? Very important role from the firm's point of view, keeping things up to date, right? Monitoring and setting timelines for license variations and renewal approvals. That, you see jobs posted for regulatory affairs people where that's the primary role of that particular position they're hiring for. Writing clear and accessible product and service descriptions that are compliant with prevailing regulations or norms. For example, on labeling requirements for pharmaceuticals or labeling requirements for any class of chemicals, right? The regulatory affairs person needs to make sure if their company is producing chemicals that all of those descriptions are in compliance with regulation. Planning and developing product trials and interpreting trial data, and right, in the case of pharmaceuticals, that's a big one, right? Advising scientists and manufacturers on regulatory requirements. Sometimes when this is early in the product design life cycle, right? Sometimes often the regulatory department from that company is brought in to discuss with scientists and the manufacturing arm of the company regulatory issues that must be in compliance with. And when you design a product, either that you design the product itself or how it's going to be manufactured, right? Providing strategic advice to senior management throughout the development of a new product or service in areas subject to regulation, current or pending, right? So these are all the types of roles that go on within regulatory affairs departments, okay? Regulatory affairs officers can also be called on to manage teams of colleagues involved with the development of new products. Sometimes you're brought into the product life cycle early on to make sure that all stages of the product life cycle are going to be in compliance with regulations that occur at different stages of the product life cycle. We'll talk about that much more in second term in post-market surveillance. Undertake and manage regulatory inspections. If the regulator shows up to do an inspection of your plant, it's the regulatory affairs people that will meet the person, take them around the plant, clarify any issues, make sure that all available information under the law is available to the regulator, and so on, right? Review company practices and provide advice on changes to a regulatory compliance system to improve regulatory compliance within your company. That will often be things you'll be asked to do, or to develop better systems for collecting, analyzing data and reporting data, all these things, right? Liaise with and make presentations to regulatory authorities. Sometimes you have to go see the regulatory authority and present a compliance plan for your company, or you're just participating in multi-stakeholder training sessions with the regulator, and you're being asked to present what your company is doing to be in compliance, and so on. These types of roles. Negotiate with the regulator on means to fix compliance shortfalls. That can be a very important issue as well. Like if your company has had an accident or there's a pattern of non-compliance, you might be brought into negotiations with the regulator to kind of sort through these types of problems and see whether there are some fixes that can bring the company back into compliance as quickly as possible. All right? So these are the types of things I want you to be thinking about and aware of in terms of the types of jobs you're going to search for at the end of the second term. Now, I usually, beginning in the second term, start pestering you about things like your CV and looking for jobs and submitting CVs for consideration for jobs and all of these types of things. And in the second term, we have an opportunity to talk more about the types of jobs that can be found out there and the types of roles that can be found for regulatory affairs people. And this lecture here is just a small piece of that, an introduction to what we will talk more about in the second term. Okay? And for that, I'll let you go, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.